Hey guys, so standing behind me, this is Centex_Jeeper on Instagram. He's the owner of Mosey here, this awesome badass TJ, and he's gonna tell us all about it.
We have a 2002 Jeep Wrangler Sahara. That's how it started out. So a Jeep TJ. All right, so up in the front, this is just a DIY bumper that I put together. Originally, it was a little bit wider when the Jeep used to have fenders, but we cut it down to make it a stubby. Right up here in the front is the Harbor Freight Badlands 12,000 pound, which is fantastic for this size of Jeep because it's roughly 4,200 pounds.
Yep. Tell me what engine you got under the hood of that thing.
Yeah, so this is the stock 4.0 liter, the inline six. So we left that absolutely the same, unmolested. There's nothing done to it.
And what do you have behind it? What transmission's behind it?
Yeah, so behind it, it's a 5-speed manual, so it's the NV 3550.
Okay.
And right behind that is the stock NP 231 transfer case.
Okay, badass. And tell me about that front axle under there, because that looks a little different than a TJ.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is what I've been working on for the past couple of months. So these axles are JK Rubicon Dana 44s front and rear. And both of them actually came out of war paint. So these are the axles that were underneath war paint JKU.
Yeah, they look a little familiar.
Yeah. So we swapped them in there, and both front and rear. And we have gears in there, 513.
All right, so tell us what spring you got there under that rig on that JK axle.
Yeah, so these are TJ springs front and rear. They're 3.5-inch rock crawlers.
Okay, they make a great spring.
Yeah, it's a good runs good on the road, and
yeah.
off road they're fantastic. Yeah.
All right, so let's chat about the rear end of this awesome beast.
Yeah, so it's a JK Dana 44 rear end. It's got an Eaton E-locker in the rear.
Okay.
And the front has the factory E-locker from Jeep.
Okay. Obviously you stretched it, right? So what'd you have to do to the frame to get that spring and everything to align right?
Yeah, so the stock TJ wheelbase is 93.4 inches. So
okay.
Before, the coil bucket used to sit somewhere right in here where you can see they made a little cutout for it.
Yep.
So right now the wheelbase as it sits is just over 103 inches. So we ended up doing 2 inches in the front and 8 inches in the rear.
Okay. So the 8-inch in the rear, I can see there, right? You notch the frame, then you put on those plates to help strengthen it up.
Yep.
And the perch is in, and then that just lined it up perfectly with the spring down there on the bottom.
Yep. So that kit is a Barnes 4-wheel drive coil relocation kit for the TJ.
Okay.
And there is no template. You slide it back as far as you want on the frame rail, and then you notch the frame rail out, and it comes with some thick 1/4-inch plate that you weld up in there. So
yeah, it's pretty awesome.
A stretch.
Yeah. Okay. And then I just noticed while we were over there too, something we didn't talk about is that rear shock, right? You said it was longer than factory, obviously. So the factory mount's gone. So tell me about that. What'd you do?
Yeah. So this is a Bilstein 5100, and this is a Clayton Offroad shock relocation kit. I didn't use the whole kit. All I did was use these mounts because I needed to slide the shock mount outside of the frame rail and outboard it in order to get it to line up with the JK axle, since it is wider than the TJ. So it runs out just on top of the frame rail, welded in there and pushed out.
All right, so obviously looking at this truss and all this stuff you got down here on the axle, what'd you do for bracketry to make all this work on a TJ, being that it was a JK axle?
So when I got this axle from Warpaint, it had a rear truss on it, but it wasn't going to work for mounting the upper control arm mounts up there on top. So I stripped the axle down, and we went with an Artec Apex truss. It's just a little bit of a different model in order to be able to take the stress from the upper control arms.
Sure.
The bracketry for the upper control arms, those are just generic builder's parts from Barnes 4-wheel drive.
Okay.
The shock mounts, the lower ones, are just shock tabs. Again, the builder's parts from Barnes 4-wheel drive.
Yep.
And I had some leftover bracketry from various kits here and there that I used for the sway bar links, and those are just welded in a place that the sway bar could fit. The sway bar is off of a stock two-door JK.
Awesome. And obviously you can't get down here without seeing that this is a triangulated 4-link rear. So what, tell us about that.
And so the kit is, the way the Jeep sits right now, it has a long arm front and rear. The front is a 3-link, and the rear is a triangulated 4-link. So that kit comes from Barnes 4-wheel drive.
All right, so obviously we talked about the triangulated 4-link, but tell me about the length of these control arms, because clearly anyone that knows what a TJ control arm looks like knows that that's not it.
The lower control arms are 2-inch quarter wall, and they, in stock form on a TJ, they're roughly 16 3/4 inches, something like that.
Okay.
And the way that these ended up after we put it all together and stretched it, they're right around 41.5, something like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I'm sure it rides a lot better, especially with the stretch, right?
Yep. And then the rears, in stock form, they were right around 15.5 inches for the upper control arms.
Okay.
And once we did the stretch again, they ended up right around 40 inches on the uppers.
All right, so clearly we know what you had to do in the rear to get that spring to work. Obviously that looks like you did something up here in the front too, because that spring perch down there looks like the factory JK spring perch, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, so the front axle, I left it exactly the same way. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do a swap from a TJ axle to a JK axle. I would say most of the time when people are running a rig like this, they will buy a swap truss kit, which puts the entire geometry, coil bucket, shock mounts, sway bar links, puts everything in stock TJ form. Well, because my axle came from war paint,
Right.
it was already sleeved, it was gusseted, it was trussed, it had chromoly shafts, everything was already done to the front axle. So rather than spending hours and hours of time cutting the truss off,
Right.
and welding a new one on there, potentially burning up my axle seals and stuff like that by burning the new truss in.
Right.
I just decided to alter the TJ geometry to fit the JK axle.
Okay, so what'd you have to do there to that upper spring perch?
Yeah.
Because it looks kind of factory, but then it, obviously has been modified.
Yeah, so this is the factory shock mount and spring perch from the Jeep. What we had to do was the JK coil buckets are 1.5 inches wider on each side than on a TJ.
Okay.
So I needed to push the spring outward on the TJ frame in order to seat it on the JK axle. So what I did was I took a little bit of 1/4-inch plate, and I cut it out and wedged it right along this stock coil bucket, and then burned it in all the way around.
Okay.
And left a little bit of extra so that the spring could slide out 1.5 inches from where it normally sits.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then you got that looks like maybe a factory bump stop in there, right? Maybe a little longer.
Yeah. So this is actually a factory TJ bump stop. Down on the bottom, we still need to do the JK bump stops.
Okay.
But right now we just have the factory TJ. I had to alter it with a little bit of just some extra DOM that I had laying around from the links. And I welded that up to this 1/4-inch plate and essentially remade what the stock TJ bump stop looks like.
So tell me some more about the geometry in the front, what you had to do with the track bar. You said you stretched it 2 inches.
So right off the bat, when you're swapping from a TJ axle to a JK axle, regardless of whether it's a Dana 30 or a Dana 44, the coil bucket on the TJ actually sits in front of the axle tube.
Okay.
On a JK, it sits directly on top of the axle tube.
Right.
So in that, by itself, with doing nothing else, that's already right at 2 inches of forward stretch, because the axle is shifted underneath the coil bucket instead of being behind it.
So that explains why you didn't have to necessarily move the coil bucket on the frame any farther forward, and you still got a 2-inch stretch. What do you have to do with your track bar?
Yeah, so after you stretch it, you need to make sure that the geometry all lines up. And what I had to do is I had to cut my stock TJ track bar off.
Okay.
And this is a part from Barnes 4-wheel drive. It's their angled track bar mount. And the reason we did the angled track bar mount was in order to get the track bar roughly in line and the same length as the drag length in order to stop bump steer and all that kind of stuff that happens with altered geometry.
All right, and obviously down here talking about links, we mentioned the rears. What about the front? Do you remember? I'm going to kind of put you on the spot. Do you remember what the factory length was, and do you know what the length is now?
Yeah, so again, the lower control arms are 2-inch factories were right at 16 1/4 on the length,
Okay.
and these are just over 31 inches, so it's almost double the length.
Wow.
Yeah. The upper on this side, since it's only a single, the upper is 38 3/4 of an inch long.
Holy cow, that's way longer than the factory, right?
Yeah, way longer. So it's 2.5 times almost.
And you can tell just by looking at them here, even in this camera angle, that I mean, those control arms are almost parallel to the ground on that 3.5-inch spring, and that right there, right, is going to change the arc of the axle travel, and it's going to make it climb things way easier just because the way it transfers that energy. You guys can see that in some of the other videos that I've had. I did one on long arms versus short arms, and we go into more detail about that.
And it's just a hydraulic assist, and comes with all the bracketry, tie rod clamp, hoses, everything you need in order to make it run great, and it turns fantastic now.
And all right, guys, so you heard it. This TJ, right, is a 2002, and it's got the JK axles under it, all the good stuff. You have any questions about it, you can definitely reach out to Sentex Jeeper on Instagram, again at Sentex_Jeeper, and find him on Instagram. You can also message me, right? Obviously we know each other, I can get you in contact with him. But again, those JK axles are out there because there's plenty of JK guys going to 1-tons, so they're for sale. And oftentimes they're for sale and they're already re-geared and they already have lockers and they're already built, sleeves, gussets, things like that. So picking them up and not having to do all that work to your current axles, plus getting the added width, right? I mean, there's a huge benefit there, and you can make them work on your rig pretty easily, as you just saw. So awesome rig.